In the 1920s, thousands of American women walked into their local beauty salon and asked for something simple, permanently smooth skin. What they got instead was radiation exposure so severe that decades later, doctors would compare their injuries to survivors of an atomic bomb. This is the history of hair removal and the machine that quietly poisoned an entire generation of women in the name of beauty. For most of human history, hair removal wasn't really controversial. Ancient Egyptian women used a sticky mixture of sugar, water, and lemon juice to pull hair from the root, a method so effective it's still used today, still sold in salons under almost the exact same recipe. Cleopatra herself was said to favor it. Roman women used pumice stones and simple bronze tweezers, part of an elaborate daily beauty routine that servants often performed for wealthier households. In some cultures, hair removal was even connected to class and status rather than gender at all, a sign of wealth, cleanliness, or religious devotion, rather than an obligation attached to being a woman specifically. None of it was framed as an emergency. None of it was framed as shameful, or as something a woman needed to quietly apologize for. That changed almost overnight in 1915. That year, the Gillette company launched a razor made specifically for women called the Milady Décolleté. Before this, American women's body hair had never really been treated as a personal failing or even much of a topic at all. Gillette needed new customers, though. The company had already saturated the men's shaving market almost completely, and growth required an entirely new audience. Fashion had just handed them the perfect opportunity. Sleeveless dresses were suddenly popular among stylish modern women. Bare arms and underarms were suddenly visible in public for the very first time in polite society. Gillette's advertising leaned hard into shame rather than simple utility. Their early ads called visible underarm hair an embarrassing personal problem, language carefully chosen to sound clinical and urgent, something no fashionable, hygienic woman would tolerate for even a moment longer. They avoided the word shaving entirely in their marketing, since it carried masculine, barbershop connotations. Women were instead encouraged to make their skin smooth, softer language for the exact same blade. Within 25 years, over 80% of young American women were shaving regularly. An entire industry, worth billions of dollars today, had been built almost from nothing on manufactured insecurity about a completely natural part of the human body. But shaving wasn't permanent, and permanence is exactly what the emerging beauty industry started promising next. Here's where the story turns genuinely dangerous. X-rays had been discovered back in 1895, and doctors quickly noticed a strange side effect. High doses caused hair to fall out completely. For serious medical conditions, this was sometimes useful. But by the early 1920s, that side effect had been repackaged into something else entirely, a cosmetic treatment sold directly to ordinary women. A New York physician named Dr. Albert Geyser built an entire business around it. He called his invention the Tricho System. Clients sat in a specially built mahogany booth and placed their face directly in front of an X-ray tube, generating radiation aimed precisely at unwanted hair. Geyser claimed the treatment was completely harmless, delivered in carefully controlled cumulative doses of at least 500 Roentgens spread across roughly 12 weeks of regular visits. Beauticians, not licensed doctors, were trained at his own Tricho Institute to operate the machines unsupervised. By 1925, Tricho salons had opened in more than 70 locations across the United States and Canada, tucked into ordinary strip malls and department stores. Advertisements promised something extraordinary and completely false: permanent, painless hair removal with a 5-year guarantee. Geyser wasn't even the only one selling this idea. A separate operator named Jules Martin ran his own competing chain of salons, carefully avoiding the word X-ray altogether in his advertising. He called his version Epil-X-rays instead, softer, friendlier branding for the exact same dangerous technology. For a while, it seemed to work exactly as promised. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what the beauty industry doesn't put in its ads, hit subscribe now. We dig up stories exactly like this one every single week. The real damage didn't show up right away. That was the terrifying part. Radiation exposure doesn't always announce itself immediately. It waits quietly, invisibly, doing damage no client could see or feel at the time. Months passed, sometimes years. Then women who had visited Tricho salons began developing something doctors called radiodermatitis, a severe chronic inflammation of the skin caused by repeated radiation exposure. Their skin grew thin and fragile, almost paper-like, stretched too tight over damaged tissue underneath that could no longer properly repair itself. Painful ulcers opened up across their faces and refused to heal properly, sometimes for months at a stretch. Deep, permanent scarring set in where hair follicles and blood vessels had been destroyed at the root. Some women's faces became visibly disfigured, the skin discolored, pitted, and prematurely aged decades beyond their actual years. A permanent public mark from a treatment they'd once been promised was completely safe. And for many, the damage didn't stop at the skin surface at all. It went deeper into the cells themselves. It became cancer. Doctors eventually gave this pattern a name almost too blunt to say out loud: North American Hiroshima Maiden Syndrome, a direct comparison to the young Japanese women who had suffered severe radiation burns and disfigurement after the atomic bombings of 1945. The comparison wasn't an exaggeration for shock value. The underlying radiation damage to human skin genuinely looked similar under a doctor's examination, whether it came from a weapon of war or a beauty salon appointment. And here's the part that should make you angry. Warnings weren't some later discovery, uncovered decades after the fact by careful historians. Medical journals had already started publishing serious concerns about X-ray hair removal by the early 1920s, practically the same years the Tricho system was aggressively expanding into new cities across 2 countries. The American Medical Association formally condemned the Tricho Institute by 1929 in plain, direct language. And still, the practice continued for another 2 full decades, well into the late 1940s, because word traveled slowly in an era before mass communication, because regulation moved even slower than the warnings themselves, and because the promise of permanently smooth skin was simply too tempting and too profitable for salons to willingly give up. A study conducted decades later, in 1970, examined over 360 patients in New York alone. Researchers found that more than a third of all radiation-induced cancers in women, across nearly 50 years of collected medical records, could be traced directly back to X-ray hair removal treatment specifically. Not weapons testing, not industrial accidents, not battlefield exposure. A routine beauty appointment paid for willingly, out of pocket, in pursuit of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon errand. So think about the full shape of this story. A razor company that manufactured shame out of a fashion trend in 1915. A medical side effect quietly repackaged as a beauty miracle in the 1920s. Thousands of women who trusted a mahogany booth in a strip mall salon with their own skin because they'd been told again and again that their bodies needed fixing. And a disease pattern so severe that doctors eventually compared it to nuclear warfare. Today, hair removal is a global industry worth more than $4 billion a year. From disposable razors and wax strips to modern laser treatments, regulated far more carefully than anything Dr. Geyser ever offered his trusting clients. But the underlying pressure that built this entire industry in the first place, the idea that a woman's natural body needs correcting before it's acceptable in public, never actually disappeared along with the mahogany booths. It just found gentler, safer, more heavily regulated machines to hide inside, while the original message stayed remarkably intact. Next time you see an ad promising permanently smooth, flawless skin, remember what that exact same promise once cost an entire generation of women who trusted it completely. If nobody ever taught you this story, imagine how many others like it are still buried in old medical journals nobody reads anymore. Subscribe if you want more of them, and tell me in the comments if you'd ever heard of the Tricho system before today. I read every single one. Next week, we're uncovering why women's asylums were quietly filled with patients who were never actually sick at all.